Hello and welcome to Gardening Basics with 4-HBC. This is our 8th lesson in a series of short videos on beginner gardening topics that range from planting your garden all the way to harvesting your produce. My name is AJ, I'm a 4-HBC ambassador, and it is my pleasure to introduce our gardening expert, Emma. Emma, would you tell us a bit about yourself?
Hey everyone, and thanks so much for the introduction, AJ. So last time I saw you guys, I was letting you know a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing on blueberry research. And so now I'll just share that the last couple of weeks I have actually been working in hop fields, harvesting a bunch of hops here in the Columbia Valley. So just a little change of pace for me these days and trying out a different commodity.
Wonderful. Well, we are looking forward to learning more about gardening today. What will we be covering, Emma?
Okay, so today we're going to look a little bit further into the idea of integrated pest management, and we're going to focus in specifically on weeds. So we're going to look at cultural control of weeds, physical control of weeds, biological control of weeds, and the chemical control of weeds. So first up, we're going to be talking about cultural control. So here's a quick video discussing some of the points about cultural control.
Hey everyone. So today we're going to continue a little bit on the concepts that we started talking about last time, which was the integrated pest management. We're going to focus in a little bit on weeds today. So when you're looking at weeds and integrated pest management, the first one we're going to talk about is cultural control. When we look at cultural control, we're basically trying to create the best growing environment for our plants in order to suppress the growth of the weeds. So one of the really good ways that we can do this is by planting plants as close together as possible. This here is maybe not the most incredible example of that at this stage in time, just because everything has gone to seed, but it will give you a really good idea that when your plants are close enough together and big enough, it really does not allow a whole lot of room for weeds to get through. Another one that we talk about when we're looking at cultural control methods would be things like a crop rotation. So this basically just means not planting the same type of crop, so a brassica is something like kale or broccoli or cauliflower, not planting that same type of crop in the same place next year in order to avoid some of the pests that are associated with it.
So really the idea with cultural control is that idea of an ounce of prevention. So manipulating your environment to be less favorable for your weeds to grow. So this is where you do things like sowing fast-growing varieties that will be naturally more competitive and outgrowing your weed species. And then things like practicing your crop rotations. And this is especially important for not just weeds, but for all pests. So there's a lot of pests that can be very specific to a certain type of crop. And so by rotating where you put those in your garden, you're going to have a really good, you'll have a lot better of a chance of making sure that those pests don't pop up the next time around. And then, like I mentioned before, when seeding, plant your seeds as close as spacing will allow to prevent having a large amount of bare soil for weeds to germinate. Next up, we're talking about physical control.
So next up, we're talking a little bit about physical control. So physical control is exactly what it sounds like when you're using anything physical, any physical method to actually control your weeds coming into your garden. Another way that we can look at this is also called mechanical control. So that would be where we actually use machinery. So that would be things like cultivators or tillers or flame weeders, anything along those lines. But when we're looking at physical control, we're really looking at physical barriers that will stop your weeds from getting through. So we talked about this at the beginning of this series when we talked a little bit about things like mulch or landscape fabric. So if you look on the ground here, we've got some bark mulch down. You see that there are some weeds coming through, but in the greater scheme of things, there's really not a whole lot. Also, when you talk about physical control, is actually just pulling out your weeds. So that's a method of physical control in and of itself. It's best to do these when they're smaller. And also, if you can, while you're pulling out your weeds, make sure that you get the entire root of that plant so that it's not able to grow through again. So you can see here, it's actually growing through some landscape fabric. So no method is going to be perfect. But if you can get as much of it covered up with something like landscape fabric and mulch and then weed it out fairly regularly, you're going to end up having a lot less weeds to deal with than you would if you just left it.
So physical control is really the most common way that we deal with weeds. Most gardeners will practice some form of physical weed control in their gardens, and this can be just as basic as, like I said, just pulling up your weeds as soon as you see them. We can also talk about physical control being mechanical, so that would be when you're using things like a rototiller, or the really fun one that some of you may have seen is things like flame weeders. So that's when people will go and before the weeds actually emerge, they will use like a blowtorch and get those weeds while they're really nice and small, or before they've actually had a chance to establish. So those are two kind of more mechanical methods of it. And something that we talked about quite often when we talked about starting your garden, or what types of gardens that you want to look at, is using a mulch on your garden. So things like straw or leaves, bark mulch, or using something like landscape fabric or plastic. These are all really good ways of physically creating a barrier between your soil and then having somewhere where your weeds are going to come up through. And so then, of course, also included in physical control is hand pulling or removing your weeds using something like a hoe. And so this is just for the best control around your desired plants while removing problem weeds in the garden. Another type of physical control that I didn't talk about in the video, but something that we did talk about really at the beginning of this series, is just designing your beds and your gardening area so that you have a space where you're less likely to have weeds come up through it. So these are things like having your raised beds and having kind of a bed where seeds can't blow into it. All of these are really good physical aspects of a garden that will help prevent the type of weeds that will come into it. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about biological control. So check out this video that talks a little bit about a different type of biological control, not so much for your garden, but more for your pasture.
So next up, we're talking about biological control. So biological control is not really something, so if you remember back to what that is, it's using a living organism in order to attack or kill something in our gardens. It doesn't really work when we're talking about a garden scenario, but where biological control works really well for weeds is in something like a rangeland or a field type of scenario. So when we're looking at biological control, you can see I've got some pigs behind me. Pigs are fantastic for doing things like keeping blackberry roots down. The other one that are really, really good and probably a little bit more well known for this are things like sheep or goats. So using sheep or goats as methods of targeted grazing work really well in a rangeland or a pasture scenario, not so much in your home garden because they will eat everything.
So like I mentioned, biological control for weeds is one of the few IPM strategies that's not really effective for your home gardener. There's not really a whole lot of insects that we can introduce into a garden that will effectively deal with things like weeds, but it does work very well in rangeland scenarios. So not really a good idea to bring in something like a goat or a sheep into your garden area. But if you are dealing with invasive weeds in some sort of pasture, this is a really good and really well used type of biological control. One of the ways that we can use biological control in a garden, if it is something that you have access to, is the idea of using something like ducks to help control slug problems. That is one way that people will use an animal in their garden scenario, or a lot of people will also let their pigs, say, till up an area that they're going to use as a garden for the next year. So there are ways that you can kind of introduce this, but it's definitely not one of the more commonly practiced IPM strategies that we use in our home gardens. So lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical control. So here's a quick video just kind of outlining some of the basics of chemical control in your gardens.
So lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical control. And so this is the one that we talked a little bit last time and how we're trying to do it so that it's the last resort that you use in your toolbox. So rather than talk about different types of chemical control for weeds, what I am going to suggest that you do is that if you're unsure about it, talk to someone at the Agriculture Extension Office. So that would be at the Ministry of Agriculture. If you are ever looking for some chemical control and you want some more information about the label and how to use it, you can look on on the Health Canada pesticide label search. So you can go into Google and type in Health Canada pesticide label search, and it will be able to give you all the information about whatever chemical that you're using, and to also make sure that if you are going to look at chemical control, that you know that your product that you're using is not something that requires a pesticide applicator's license, and that you have read and followed all of the information and the label before actually using any of these products.
So when we talk about chemical control in weeds, it is a little bit tricky. It should definitely be used as a last resort. There are some instances where chemical control of weeds may be necessary in the home garden, and there are definitely varying degrees or types of chemicals that you can be used. So chemical control of weeds is a very effective tool, but it's important to understand how they work and what the best product is to use for your situation. One of the main problems that we have in chemical control is the idea of the development of resistance. So this is really when a chemical is no longer effective on a certain weed or pest, and that really is just due to overuse. So like I mentioned in the video, it's really important to read and follow the label on any herbicide being used. Labels will all have directions on how to apply the product safely for both the user and the environment, and how to avoid developing resistance, which is really important. I mentioned in the video that you can go onto the Health Canada website and look up their pesticide label search. But if you're having questions about where to even start or what to do, you can also send an email to the BC government and their IPM department and ask them whether or not a certain product might be right for the use that you're looking for. So you can go to send an email to bc.ipm@gov.bc.ca, and they will be able to give you a little bit better idea of whether or not a product that you're looking at using is right for your application. But when we're talking about chemical control, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is as intense as, say, something that requires a pesticide applicator's license. Chemical control also includes things like using vinegar on your weeds or something along those lines. So there are a lot of options for you to look into, but it's just really important to make sure that when you're going down this route, that it is the last option that you decide to use, and that you've done all of your research to make sure that you're choosing the right product and are using it safely and effectively.
Thanks, Emma. I really found it interesting learning about the biological control section, as I did not know a lot about it before I saw this webinar. And I did have two questions that I was hoping to ask. The first one is, what is the most efficient type of control? Is there one that is more beneficial and works better out of all of them, or are they all equally good to use?
AJ, that's a really good question, and I'm glad that you asked it. So with weeds especially, your best bet is going to be using things like physical control. Cultural control will definitely get you quite far with your prevention, but when it comes to dealing with weeds, they are unfortunately a fact of gardening. There's definitely not going to be many gardens out there that somebody doesn't do anything and weeds don't end up in it. It just is part of life when it comes to gardening. So if you're really good and on top of your physical control, so that means doing things like putting down your mulches or your landscape fabric, and then using any tools that might be available to you to help control them, and then just getting out there and literally just pulling them as they come up. This will 100% be the best way at helping prevent being overrun with weeds in your garden. But if it does happen, don't worry, because it happens to all of us.
Awesome. My last question is, with chemical control, do the pros outweigh the cons, or is it the other way around, I guess?
So that's another really good question, and I feel like it's something that a lot of people wonder about. With chemical control, I don't know if it's really a question of pros outweighing the cons. There definitely are going to be a lot of pros and cons. I think with this one, it really depends on your situation, right? So if you're dealing with a very invasive weed, like say, for example, something that is a really bothersome one here on the coast would be something like Japanese knotweed. There's not really a whole lot that you can do other than getting rid of the actual plant material and then using something like glyphosate or Roundup in order to control it. It's a really difficult weed to control. So in that specific type of scenario, absolutely using chemical control is a very effective way of dealing with that problem. But when it comes to things like people going around and spot treating dandelions in their lawn, that would be one of those instances where I would say that maybe the cons in that scenario kind of outweigh any of the benefits of not having any dandelions. So in that question, I mean, I know it's not a direct answer, but it really is kind of a case-by-case basis. There are going to be some instances where using chemicals is the most effective way of dealing with the problem, and then there are other ones where realistically we could probably look to maybe pulling out dandelions instead of resorting to using a herbicide to deal with them.
Awesome. Thanks again, Emma, for sharing all this great information on integrated pest management of weeds. Would you be able to tell us what we'll be covering in our next lesson?
Absolutely. So next time we are going to look in depth at gardening for pollinators. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you next time.